In the quiet town of Dayton, where everyone knows each other, something happened that changed lives forever. On May 20th, 2013, two friends, 15-year-old Kathleen and 12-year-old Daisy, were walking home from school, but their usual route ended in horror when a stranger in a red pickup truck offered them a job. Instead of work, he took them deep into the woods, where a desperate fight for survival began. One of them escaped, the other vanished. Attacks, abductions, and torture had caught the attention of law enforcement multiple times, but why was he still free? Why did the system meant to protect people keep failing? And what really happened to Kathleen, whose last words were, "We didn't deserve this"? Kathleen Shepard and Daisy Hughes grew up across the street from each other in the small town of Dayton. With a population of fewer than 1,000 people, in such a quiet, close-knit community, everyone knew each other, and the town had a unique sense of safety, until tragedy struck, shaking the residents to their core. Kathleen was 3 years older than Daisy at the time of the events in 2013. She was 15, while Daisy was 12. Despite the age difference, they were best friends who did everything together. They often walked to and from the school bus stop side by side. May 20th, 2013 was no different. The bus pulled up, they stepped off, and as they made their way home, they noticed a red pickup truck trailing behind them. The man inside quickly caught their attention and offered them an opportunity to make some money. He claimed to own a lawn care business, but said he was short on workers and wanted to help the girls earn some extra cash. At first, he doubted they even knew how to mow lawns, but he was so persuasive, putting on an entire performance, that they found themselves convincing him otherwise. The stranger then offered to drive them home so they could grab their things before heading to the job. But that was never his plan. As soon as they got into the truck, he changed the story. He suddenly remembered that he had work uniforms in smaller sizes, making a trip home unnecessary. Instead, he drove them straight out of town. When the girls began to resist, he pulled out a gun and threatened to kill them both. Their destination was an abandoned house with an old, decrepit shed, and used for years and eerie in appearance. The man tied them up, forced them face down into the dirt, and told them that if they obeyed and did everything he asked, he would let them go, even drive them back to town. But 12-year-old Daisy knew something was terribly wrong. Why take them so far from town if he didn't plan to kill them? Why the gun? The setting, the atmosphere, and his behavior all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Kathleen's last words were, "We didn't deserve this." Then, the man took her into the woods, leaving Daisy behind with one chance to escape. She couldn't say for certain what happened to Kathleen. She never saw it with her own eyes, but she heard the horrifying screams of her best friend, and one thing was clear. He wasn't planning to shoot her. Although the kidnapper used a gun to threaten them, he was careless enough to leave it behind in the shed, right in front of the 12-year-old captive. When he took Kathleen away, the ropes binding Daisy weren't as tight as he thought, allowing her to loosen them and break free. As she ran for her life, she grabbed the firearm. Just in case, Daisy wasn't thinking about anything except escaping, but she was prepared to defend herself if the kidnapper caught up to her. Terrified, she pushed through the forest, stumbling over sharp roots and branches. Then she found a dirt road and kept walking, desperately searching for help. There was no one around. Despite the pain and injury she had sustained, she couldn't stop. She was convinced he was still right behind her, that she wouldn't make it out alive. When Daisy finally found help, she was handed over to the police. She was in such a state of panic that she hadn't even realized she had lost her shoes while fleeing. Her feet were covered in deep, bloody cuts, torn open from running barefoot. On top of that, she had suffered multiple injuries from the kidnapper's abuse. Thankfully, none were life-threatening. The wounds on her feet healed quickly, but the psychological scars, those would stay with her much longer. She was treated at the hospital for her physical injuries, but even now, she still struggles with the emotional trauma of that night. Daisy provided investigators with a detailed description of both the kidnapper and his truck that gave detectives a solid lead. They had a real chance of catching him before he struck again. Then, around 8 p.m., in a rural area not far from where Daisy had been found, police made a chilling discovery on the grounds of a secluded property northeast of Dayton. They came across the body of a man. He was later identified as 42-year-old Michael Klunder, the same man Daisy had described. Curiously, the cause of death wasn't immediately disclosed. The circumstances surrounding the incident were murky, and law enforcement needed more information. Klunder had left behind no suicide note, no explanation, nothing that pointed to where Kathleen might be. This was a devastating setback. With no clear direction, police were forced to search blindly, racing against time to find the missing girl. As the investigation continued, detectives started digging into Klunder's past, and what they uncovered was deeply unsettling. Back in 1989, the first trial was held for 17-year-old Michael Klunder from Mason City. He broke into a home, attempted to rob the place, and nearly strangled the homeowner, a young woman named Jill Gilsey. According to a reconstruction of the events, on February 22, 1989, a young man showed up at Jill's doorstep, claiming his car had broken down and asking to use her phone. However, Jill had a better idea. She offered to drive him home so he could take care of the issue and return for his car later. In reality, Michael didn't care how he lured his victim in, so he agreed. The moment Jill opened the front door, he knocked her down, pinned her to the floor, hit her multiple times, and attempted to strangle her with his bare hands. She managed to survive only because she fought back with everything she had. As she started to lose consciousness, Jill twisted her body and used her last bit of strength to kick him away. Michael had strangled her so fiercely and for so long that visible bruises from his hands remained on her neck. After the attack, Jill was furious. She was determined to make sure he faced justice. Michael was charged with second-degree burglary and assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm, both with aggravating circumstances. However, after his arrest, the judge ruled that he could be released on bail until the trial began. This leniency outraged Jill, especially since the judge set the bail lower than the maximum allowed for these charges. It seemed as if the court didn't understand how violent and dangerous this man was. Fortunately, Michael couldn't afford bail anyway, so he remained behind bars while awaiting trial. Not only Jill, but many others who knew and believed he had gotten off too easily, and they had good reasons to think so. During the preliminary hearings, the court had to decide whether to try 17-year-old Michael as a juvenile or an adult offender. The juvenile court judge waived jurisdiction, as Michael was turning 18 in just a few months in May of that year. Additionally, testimony from juvenile justice officials painted a disturbing picture of his past behavior. It turned out that Michael's criminal history had started much earlier, and from the beginning, his actions were deeply troubling. He had always been problematic and aggressive, especially toward women. In November 1986, when he was 15, Michael dragged a female classmate into a school bathroom. He pointed a gun at her and ordered her to remove her shirt. The girl refused, fought back, and tried to escape his grip. In response, he struck her multiple times in the head with a metal object, then continued beating her with his fists and feet. She suffered severe injuries and spent nearly a week in the hospital recovering. Following this incident, Michael Klunder was sent to a specialized school for boys and ordered to undergo treatment at a mental health facility, both institutions designed to rehabilitate troubled teens. In February 1988, Michael Klunder was released after completing all court-ordered requirements following his attack on the girl in the school restroom. He returned home to Mason City, where he now lived with his father and stepmother. However, he couldn't suppress his violent nature for long. Soon after, he carried out the attack on Jill. After being arrested for assaulting Jill, Michael was held in an adult jail. Authorities recommended minimizing his contact with older inmates, fearing that he could either display aggressive behavior or, given the nature of his charges, become a target for abuse. However, Michael was a skilled manipulator and liar, capable of influencing other young offenders in negative ways. The charges against him carried a potential sentence of up to 12 years in prison, along with fines of up to $15,000. If he had been tried as a juvenile, the maximum sentence would have been only 7 years. This gave his attorney both a goal and a bargaining chip. On March 30th, Michael pleaded guilty to attempted burglary and attempted assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. On May 1st, just 2 weeks before his 18th birthday, Michael appeared in court for sentencing. Afterward, he was transferred to the Cherokee Mental Health Institute, where he underwent a psychiatric evaluation while serving his sentence. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the attack on Jill. He spent his 18th birthday behind bars. In addition, he received a 2-year sentence for burglary, but both sentences ran concurrently, meaning he would be released after just 5 years. This deeply concerned Jill, but there was nothing she could do. The court ruled that extending his sentence further would be inhumane, likely believing that rehabilitation was possible for a potentially dangerous repeat offender. Despite the relatively short sentence, Michael's defense attorneys pushed for an even lighter punishment. Their main argument was his age. While he had been tried as an adult, he was still legally a minor. Fortunately, by September 1989, the court denied their request for a sentence reduction. 2 years passed, his burglary sentence was completed, leaving only the assault charge. He had 3 more years before his official release. Michael followed all court requirements closely, including participating in a rehabilitation program for offenders with a history of sexual violence. He appeared committed, attending all sessions, but it was questionable whether he truly wanted to change. His attorney aggressively pursued an early release, arguing that Michael was fully rehabilitated. His spotless record in prison, without a single fight, worked in his favor. Michael Klender's defenders managed to get his case reopened, and he was released in 1991. Just shy of turning 20, the troubled young man was on probation, but his old habits quickly resurfaced. In 1992, 2 young girls, barely 3 years old, went missing near Michael's home while they were playing in a sandbox. Their parents quickly realized they had been abducted and immediately contacted the police. A search began, with hopes for the best, but fearing the worst. Then, out of nowhere, a call came into the police station. An unknown caller reported that the girls had been found at a bus stop. The stop was nearly 100 miles away from their hometown. A passerby had noticed a small orange container under a shelter and, upon opening it, made a shocking discovery. He immediately called the authorities. When officers arrived, they found the girls inside. Both had suffered, though they survived the horrific attack, though their recovery was long. Michael Klender quickly became the prime suspect after several witnesses came forward. One woman had noticed him staring at young girls from his window. He often stood in his kitchen or living room, watching children play outside or observing schoolgirls as they walked home. In light of the abduction, these behaviors raised serious concerns. The day after the girls were found, the police visited Michael's home and questioned him. However, there was no solid evidence to charge him yet. Detectives needed to gather information from the 3-year-olds without further traumatizing them, but their fear and age made it difficult for them to communicate. After their initial interview, no useful details were gathered. Michael denied any involvement, and with no proof, the police had to leave. This gave the criminal a critical head start. He seized the opportunity, driving off in his 1982 Honda, heading to Florida. However, the car broke down on the way. Stranded, Michael turned to a relative for help, not realizing that this would lead to his capture. The tip-off came from the relative, who suspected Michael was up to something again, even though he hadn't heard about the abduction. The girls had been living in the same housing complex in Charles City where Michael was from. The complex seemed safe, under surveillance, with a playground where the girls were playing when they were taken. It appeared that Michael had been watching them for some time before seizing the opportunity when the girls were unsupervised. Surveillance footage showed the children playing and then suddenly looking off in the same direction. Before walking off together, detectives believed Michael had lured them while staying out of sight, avoiding the cameras. The miraculous rescue of the girls was even covered on the news. Michael had locked them in the container and left it at the bus stop. Had the box not been discovered within hours, who knows what might have happened. A fortunate passerby and a quick response saved their lives. Medical reports confirmed that neither girl had been sexually assaulted, though they did suffer physical injuries. Both had been struck several times, and one showed clear signs of strangulation on her neck. The same fate could have befallen the other, but for some unknown reason, Michael showed her less interest. The girl, still shaken, described in broken sentences how a large man had grabbed her by the neck, making it hard to breathe, but something stopped him before he could finish. This miraculous escape provided valuable information. Initially, the girls were too scared to speak, but eventually, they were able to help detectives piece together the truth. Over time, the girls recalled how the abductor had tried to strangle both of them when he took them far away. They remembered the perpetrator quite clearly and were able to provide a description that closely matched Michael Klender. They also described his clothing. When they were shown his photo, they recoiled in fear, recognizing their tormentor. With this, the suspect was arrested and charged with kidnapping and inflicting bodily harm on the children. In Iowa, even kidnapping can result in a life sentence. And with his criminal history and similar behavior patterns, Michael quickly drew attention. He was genuinely surprised when detectives returned to his home and read him his rights. At the hearings, Michael's attorney attempted to seek leniency. Michael was found guilty of third-degree kidnapping, but the charge of assault was reduced. This was made possible because no one died in the container, and there was no evidence of strangulation. For the bodily harm charges, he received only 2 years, and for the third-degree kidnapping, he received 10 years for each count. The jury didn't deliberate for long before reaching a decision. Michael was already behind bars when, 5 months later, a new crime came to light. It turned out that he had other criminal episodes he had been hiding. This added another kidnapping charge to his sentence, also without a fatal outcome. The total prison sentence now exceeded 30 years, which he would serve consecutively. Despite this, his lawyer did not give up, shifting the focus to Michael's mental state. The lawyer argued that Michael needed treatment and rehabilitation rather than time in prison. There were indeed grounds for such claims, as the young man had shown signs of being mentally unbalanced. When he was first arrested and interrogated, he appeared detached and indifferent. When Michael finally confessed, he was simply asked why he had kidnapped and strangled the 3-year-old girls. He couldn't provide a coherent explanation and later claimed it was because he had a bad day. It's hard to understand how someone can behave in prison to receive such leniency. But Michael was released in 2011 after serving only 20 years. He was placed on probation again, but it was clear he would not complete it. No sooner had he been freed than he began committing crimes again. This time, his release ended in a far more tragic manner for everyone. Michael Klender abducted Caitlin and Daisy. One of the girls managed to escape again. Thanks to a stroke of luck, the search for the second continued. This brought Michael's officially recorded victim count to 7, most of whom were minors. It turned out that his criminal record could have been much longer. In 1992, Michael had lived in another state, where he had also committed crimes. One of these involved the kidnapping of Lori Lee Smith, an 18-year-old girl he lured into his car. Initially, the girl was driving home on a rural road outside the city. It was late at night, and the road was nearly empty. Suddenly, she saw in her rearview mirror that someone was flashing their headlights and signaling for her to stop. Lori pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down her window. Michael, having stopped beside her, told her that her rear lights weren't working. He suggested she step out and check for herself and offered to help inspect the light. Unaware of the danger, the victim got out of the car, but as soon as she was near the trunk, Michael pulled out a knife. Threatening her with a weapon, he forced her into his car. However, Lori didn't back down and fought back fiercely. They struggled in Michael's car until a truck passed by. Michael saw the truck driver start to turn around, likely because he saw the struggle and intended to help the girl. In response, Michael threw Lori out of his car and quickly fled the scene. It is worth noting that until the very end, all of Michael's victims had survived, until he abducted Caitlin Shepard. However, to speak definitively about this, it was necessary to thoroughly cross-check Michael's biography. After the criminal was released in 2011 and before the abduction of his victims in 2013, he had a considerable amount of time to carry out his dirty deeds. It was clear he had no intention of rehabilitating. Michael was believed to have committed many more similar crimes, including those that may have resulted in fatalities. In most cases, his victims were saved by sheer luck, and those chances could have easily been non-existent. There could also be unsolved abductions and even murders linked to him. For instance, he was suspected of being involved in the disappearance of 2 other girls, ages 8 and 10, in 2012 when Lyra Cook Morrissey and Elizabeth Collins from Evansdale, Iowa, went missing. However, no concrete evidence ever connected Michael to their disappearances. At the time of the girls' disappearance, Michael's phone was pinging in a different area, which cleared him of suspicion. This case remains unsolved to this day. The fate of 15-year-old Caitlin Shepard remained a mystery. Detectives continued to analyze information in the last days of the kidnapper's life. Interestingly, it seemed as though he had been trying to create the appearance of a normal life. He had a steady job, bought a house, and even had a wife named Lisa. She, too, was from a small town, a place that serial abductors like Michael often favored. In such towns, children are more trusting. Many people don't lock their doors, and it's easier for criminals like him to operate. Michael's luck wasn't just with his victims, but also with himself. Despite being required to be listed in the registry of offenders prone to sexual assault and under constant surveillance, Lisa had no idea about her husband's past. Naturally, detectives decided to search the couple's home first. On February 25, 2013, around 10 police vehicles arrived at their address. Detectives spoke with the neighbors, trying to determine if they had seen Caitlin, but no one recognized her photo. Lisa listened in bewilderment as the police revealed the truth about her husband. She was shocked by the information. However, she couldn't provide any valuable details herself. Investigators confirmed that she was not involved in the abductions. Finally, 12-year-old Daisy regained consciousness and spoke with the detectives, later giving several interviews. This allowed the full details of the girl's escape to come to light. Detectives visited the shed where she had been held, but found no trace of Caitlin. The hope of the safe return of 15-year-old Caitlin began to rapidly fade when bloodstains found in the kidnapper's car matched her DNA. What had happened to Caitlin Shepard remained a mystery. However, the perpetrator's behavior could be predicted. When he returned and realized that his younger captive had escaped, taking his weapon with her, he decided it was all over and took his own life. It's likely that the criminal didn't want to return to prison, knowing that other inmates would make his life unbearable due to his crimes against children. Something terrible must have happened to Caitlin for him to choose death over a life sentence. There was still no information about the older girl, even after they discharged her 12-year-old friend from the medical center. The search operation continued. In the early days, it led to the discovery of the girls' backpacks that Michael had left in the woods. It was likely that both children were meant to die, and the younger girl's intuition turned out to be right. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that the fate of Kathleen Shepard was uncovered. She was found several miles from their hometown. Naturally, the condition of the schoolgirl's body was poor, so identification took some time. Eventually, she was confirmed to be 15-year-old Kathleen Shepard. The cause of her death was multiple injuries inflicted by blunt and sharp objects. The same zip ties used to restrain Daisy were also found on her body. Kathleen became Michael Klander's last victim, if you don't count the fact that he also killed himself. However, whether he was truly human is highly questionable. Amid all these events, the public was outraged. There were accusations against law enforcement for protecting and enabling a dangerous killer more than they were protecting those he could harm. It's worth noting that one of the few people who genuinely mourned Michael was his wife, Lisa Klander. Could it be that she was the only one who saw something human in him that could have inspired affection? Or was it simply the result of a manipulative relationship with a psychopath?
Stories about family values and love are often heard. But what if behind a seemingly perfect facade hides a nightmare that's hard to even imagine? Today's story is one of the most chilling cases in modern criminal history in the United States. In the quiet town of Springfield, Missouri, a drama unfolded that shook the entire world. An ordinary family, the Stouts, was hiding a terrifying secret. Behind the facade of a loving mother and dutiful daughter lurked two cold-blooded killers. When 24-year-old Sarah Stout was brought to the hospital with multiple organ failures, the doctors were baffled. A strange illness had already claimed the lives of her father, Mark, and her brother, Sean. But was it really an illness? An anonymous call from the local Lutheran church, where Diana Stout played the organ, prompted the police to start an investigation. The pastor was convinced that these deaths were no accident, and his suspicions turned out to be more than justified. This story has it all: betrayal, fear, money, and the most terrifying thing: when loved ones become the biggest danger. How did a mother and daughter organize a series of murders in their own family? Why did they choose their own relatives as victims? And how did the surviving sister cope with this betrayal? For the staff of the Springfield Medical Center in Missouri, USA, June 2013 turned out to be very stressful. When 24-year-old Sarah Stout was brought to the hospital, she was in poor condition. She was losing consciousness and screaming in pain when she came to. They discovered she had a brain hemorrhage and kidney failure. Her organs were shutting down and then sporadically starting to work again chaotically. The doctors couldn't figure out what was happening to the young patient who was fading away right before their eyes. The fight for Sarah's life went on for several days. Finally, the police arrived after receiving an anonymous call. Someone reported that the Stout family had been suffering from strange illnesses for a year that were claiming lives. First, Sarah's father, Mark, then her brother, Sean, both died without receiving medical help. Now it was Sarah's turn. The girl was much luckier since she ended up in the medical center. Otherwise, she would have already perished by now. The police began investigating the mysterious illness that had struck the Stout family. Detectives believed it wasn't a coincidence. This was a large family of 6 people. Mark and Diana were the parents of Sean and 3 daughters, Sarah, Rachel, and Brianna. Mark Stout was born in St. Louis in 1961 and was the head of this family. He met his future wife in Texas while studying at college. From the start, the young couple seemed like opposites, but they soon found common ground and started dating. Mark was always positive, creative, and played in a band. Whereas Diana appeared to be more complex, reserved, and introverted, their relationship developed quickly, and soon the girl became pregnant, leading them to decide to get married immediately. When Sean was born, Diana continued her studies, graduated from nursing school, and then worked in the cardiology department of a hospital. Meanwhile, Mark became a stay-at-home dad, taking care of the house and children. It seemed that the wife was more focused on career success. She worked hard to provide everything necessary for the family. The young mother was searching for a better-paying position, which required several relocations until the Stout family finally settled in Springfield, Missouri. It was a quiet town, perfect for raising children and family life. Moreover, it was Diana's hometown, a rather conservative and religious place where she felt most confident. In the following years, 3 girls were born into the marriage. On the surface, they seemed like the ideal family. Nevertheless, everything wasn't as smooth as it appeared. For instance, Sean suffered from health problems from an early age. During his school years, he was diagnosed with autism, requiring special conditions. Despite the efforts of the family patriarch, the girls also encountered difficulties in school, especially Sarah. However, even that wasn't the family's main challenge. They simply didn't have enough money for a decent life. With the growing family, one person could no longer manage to support everyone else. Besides, they needed to buy a new home because the old one no longer had enough space. Mark occasionally contributed to the family budget when he found some temporary work. Sometimes he worked as a bartender, but most of his time was devoted to the children. In his free time, he engaged in creativity, writing music, songs, and playing multiple musical instruments. Unsurprisingly, he began performing with his musical group. This also started bringing in some income, but it still wasn't enough for such a large family. Despite the problems, it seemed they were ready to overcome all difficulties together. At least that's how it looked until April 8, 2012. The police were called to the family's home the day after Mark's 61st birthday. Here they found the already cooling body of the man. According to his wife, he died from an unknown illness similar to the flu, which progressed rapidly and ended in a fatal seizure. Diana recounted that her husband had been suffering from an unknown illness for several days. She spent all her time with him to ease his pain. Nonetheless, Mark's condition kept worsening. The circumstances seemed strange. Even the body itself looked unusual. Specifically, the deceased man's skin was noticeably yellower than that of a healthy person. According to Diana, on the day of his death, a seizure occurred. Despite the fact that her husband had never experienced anything like it before, she believed it was related to his age. She claimed that when the seizure happened, she wanted to take Mark to the hospital, but he insisted on staying home to recover. Despite this, she ignored his wishes and started preparing. But by the time she was ready, she found her husband lifeless. 45 minutes had passed since the seizure, and she immediately called emergency services. After a quick examination, nothing suspicious was found. The cause of death was recorded as natural causes, citing the deceased's age. Sean, their son, was deeply worried about his father during this period. He even described all the symptoms his father suffered from on his social media page and doubted the natural cause of death. Diana insisted that her husband's body should be cremated. Afterward, his ashes were scattered over a local lake near the church. For everyone, Mark's death was a real shock. He was strong, healthy, and active. It was strange how suddenly he deteriorated. However, this incident didn't raise as many suspicions as the next tragedy that befell the Stout family. 5 months later, on September 2, 2012, the police were called to another house under similar circumstances. It was a larger house that suited the family better. Diana had bought new property by selling the old house and receiving insurance payouts after her husband's death. Diana reported finding her 26-year-old son, Sean, dead in his room on that fateful day. The situation was similar to the progressive flu that her husband hadn't survived. This time, having had an unpleasant experience after her husband's death, she reacted quickly and took her son to the doctor on the second day after the symptoms appeared. They couldn't find anything suspicious except for water imbalance in his body. After that, Sean's condition continued to worsen, but his mother didn't take him back to the doctors. According to her, he refused medical help and felt uncomfortable. She justified this behavior due to his autism. The night before his death, Sean seemed to feel better. She assumed the unknown illness had subsided and went to church with her daughters to pray for Sean. He was just sleeping, but when they returned, he showed no signs of life. It seemed he tried to get up from the bed and fell, so he lay on the floor. A pool of blood flowed from his mouth. Sean's death shocked everyone. He worked at a center helping people with disabilities. Everyone described him as very positive and friendly. Like Mark, Sean was cremated, and his ashes were scattered over the lake. Before the next incident involving the family, 9 months had passed. Now in June 2013, the eldest daughter, Sarah, was hospitalized with similar symptoms that killed her brother and father. Police arrived at the hospital 2 days after the girl was admitted in critical condition. Doctors fought for her life, but couldn't tell the police anything specific. Doctors continued trying to determine the cause of the strange, flu-like illness. But it was strange that Sarah's kidneys and brain had failed. They conducted numerous tests, and though they didn't say it aloud, already suspected poisoning. As it turned out, the police were alerted by an anonymous call made from the church the family attended, where Diana had played the organ for many years. The pastor didn't believe these events were coincidental and feared the killer would escape justice, so he contacted the police. He expressed his suspicions that Sean's, Mark's deaths, and Sarah's critical condition were interconnected. According to the pastor, the first death, Mark's, seemed strange. He was healthy until the last moment. When Sean died under similar circumstances, the pastor seriously suspected Diana's involvement in these incidents. During this period, the woman told everyone her daughter was simply sick. At the same time, she behaved like a grieving widow and mother who had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances, allowing her to receive full support from the religious community. However, the pastor believed Diana used this mask intentionally to avoid uncomfortable questions. When the woman visited her daughter in the hospital for the last time, she acted completely differently. Nurses recounted that she was in high spirits even when she brought the dying Sarah to the hospital, joking and talking more about an upcoming trip to Florida than her daughter's health. All this happened despite the alarming forecast from the doctors, who weren't sure if the girl would survive this mysterious ailment. It seemed like the mother didn't care. All this only strengthened the authorities' suspicions about her. Still, they had nothing concrete to charge Diana with, so she was asked to voluntarily come to the station for questioning. She agreed. On June 20th, 2013, she appeared at the police department. By this point, Sarah's condition had stabilized slightly, but none of the tests conducted by the doctors showed any toxins or poisons in her system. It seemed like they had been completely processed and left no trace. Detectives understood they needed to carefully question the probable poisoner. The bodies of Sean and Mark had been cremated, making it impossible to exhume and conduct numerous tests, complicating the investigation into their deaths. Therefore, they hoped Sarah would survive and help the investigation. They wanted to learn about the circumstances of the victims' final days and possibly uncover clues about the cause of their deterioration. Diana's story about Sarah was similar to her account of Sean's death. She went to church with the other girls on that fateful day, and when she returned, she noticed her eldest daughter was in bad shape. Prior to this, Sarah had suffered from similar symptoms as her brother and father, but in milder form. Therefore, the storyteller didn't panic and didn't seek medical help. The woman thought no one could help her anyway. When Diana returned home and found her daughter in critical condition, she first wondered if Sarah had attempted suicide. Sarah suffered from bipolar disorder and might have harmed herself. Her mother reviewed all the medications the girl had access to, and repeatedly claimed that her daughter wanted to end her life. Repeatedly, similar incidents had occurred when Sarah cut her wrists. Everything sounded like the woman was insistently trying to convince the police of her version. Diana wasn't told about the parallel investigation into Mark's and Sean's deaths, although their passing was now considered suspicious. Investigators didn't want to spook the potential murderer. Sarah remained in the hospital as doctors continued searching for toxins. During this meeting at the police station, Diana behaved strangely. While answering questions, she began recounting how Sarah was a difficult child, unable to find a job recently, and performed poorly in school. At the same time, tuition fees were high, and her revelations sounded like justification for some action. This seems strange because one wouldn't usually think about such things while their daughter was dying in the hospital. Then the main suspect began discussing her dislike for her husband, who barely worked and spent all his free time on entertainment. The detectives simply listened as confessions poured out one after another. Diana admitted she always considered Sarah problematic. Due to her bipolar disorder, the girl continued living with the family and had no plans to move out. The mother admitted she had long hoped the girl would take her own life. Now the woman was convinced it had happened. Diana reiterated several times that she hadn't harmed her loved ones. Eventually, under pressure from the detectives, she unexpectedly confessed. The widow informed the detectives that her husband and children drank antifreeze. This clarified everything, as poisoning with this substance is indeed very dangerous. It has symptoms resembling various chemical compounds, complicating its detection. It causes a slow, agonizing death. The woman admitted she drank antifreeze herself, claiming she saw her family doing it for some reason. Of course, the detectives didn't believe these absurd stories. Suspicions were quickly confirmed when they checked the search history in the woman's browser. It turned out that long before her husband's death, she had begun searching for information about poisoning signs and methods, including antifreeze. She clearly chose the most effective and discreet means of murder. She explored various drugs, minerals, and essential oils that suppress the body. She didn't hesitate in her wording, so some searches were very provocative. For example, how to kill my husband, or how do people with bipolar disorder kill themselves? All this indicated planning murders long before her husband's death. When confronted with this during a follow-up meeting, Diana denied guilt, but broke under the pressure of the detectives. The suspect admitted the death of her husband didn't happen as initially described. When the seizure occurred, the woman ensured there were no signs of life, then waited 5 more minutes to ensure Mark wouldn't be saved. According to Diana's confession, she did this because she hated her husband. Everyone described the man as kind and bright, likely causing hatred due to their approach to the family budget. Diana simply couldn't handle the workload at work, being the primary breadwinner, but never received help from her husband. She harbored the same hatred toward her son, Sean. She couldn't stand looking at him, considering him a major problem for the family. Instead of seeking understanding and warmth from his mother, the boy merely sought solace each time she drove him out of the room whenever he entered. Moreover, Sean began suspecting something after researching his father's illness. When Mark died, she realized she wouldn't tolerate her sick son anymore. Therefore, she began adding antifreeze to his drinks daily. It took just a few days to reach a lethal dose in his system, according to the woman. But this was a lie. The boy suffered agonizingly for over a week before finally passing away. Now her attention and dissatisfaction focused on her eldest daughter. In the mother's opinion, the girl had become the family's main problem. She wasted too much money on education, but was bound to fail due to her lack of talent. The girl dreamed of becoming a French translator. She took out a student loan, and soon after graduating, needed to repay it, but had no job prospects. The mother refused to pay her debts. Diana hated Sarah for not finding a job and resolving her financial issues independently. 4 days before the girl was hospitalized, her mother began adding antifreeze to her food. At the police station, she admitted she sent her daughter to the hospital so quickly because she couldn't bear witnessing her suffering anymore. Naturally, the woman felt no compassion. The story about trying to kill painlessly turned out to be fantasy. In reality, she prepared drinks that were nearly half antifreeze. Experts calculated that a single bottle could kill up to 30 people at once. All this was stored in the refrigerator, methodically poisoning her family. This was alarming, especially given the presence of 2 other daughters in the house, including Brianna, who was only 12. Still, the mother wasn't afraid that the youngest daughter might accidentally drink it. as her plan already included her murder immediately after Sarah's death. However, physical evidence was needed to convict the woman. Despite the cremation of her husband and son, fragments of Mark and Sean's remains could still be examined after autopsy. Detectives proposed examining them to see if the deadly substance left traces in their systems. Tests revealed the presence of ethylene glycol, one of the main components of antifreeze. Before arresting the poisoner, the police decided to check if she had an accomplice, as it was difficult to execute the plan alone. It was hard to imagine keeping everyone in the dark about her intentions. Without revealing their suspicions to Diana, they simply arrested her and summoned her other daughter, 22-year-old Rachel, for questioning. When told her mother confessed to poisoning the family, Rachel's behavior changed dramatically. She became visibly nervous, clearly knowing more than she admitted. The detectives just wanted to talk to her to understand what was happening at home. Even before Diana's confession, Rachel had acted strangely, laughing inappropriately and joking despite discussing the deaths of relatives, but she denied everything. When suspicions arose, the police decided to test their assumptions and conducted repeated searches of the house. They found Rachel's diary, which became a valuable source of information, revealing the full extent of the evil deeds. A curious entry mentioned that soon her father, and then her brother, would die. She calmed herself with thoughts of inheriting money and her father's car. Most troubling was that the entry was written 10 months before Mark's death, clearly indicating Rachel was aware of her mother's terrifying plans and didn't try to stop or warn anyone. Apparently, it suited her that her entire family would soon die. When shown the diary, Rachel was clearly unprepared for this twist. She quickly broke down and confessed she had been her mother's accomplice from the start. The collaboration began when the daughter helped Diana research methods and poisons online. They discovered that store-bought antifreeze contained a bitter component, preventing accidental ingestion, making it unsuitable for poisoning, so they purchased it online. In executing their sinister plan, the woman prepared poisoned food and drinks, which the daughter delivered to her father, brother, and even sister. According to her confession, they poisoned each family member up to 3 times a day. The idea of using antifreeze was Rachel's suggestion. According to the accomplice, she had the best relationship with her mother among all family members, and Rachel was always the favorite daughter. Like Diana, she disliked the others, considering them burdens, so both decided to eliminate them and start a new life together. Acquaintances of the Stout family were stunned when Rachel posted on her social media a month after her brother's death. "I think I haven't seen Mom so relaxed in a long time." It seemed they were satisfied with the outcome. Rachel admitted they discussed each murder in detail. Both agreed Mark should die, but regarding Sean, Rachel was unsure. She thought placing him in a specialized institution permanently would suffice. Rachel even argued with her mother about Sean, as she didn't want him dead, but later agreed it would be better to eliminate him. Of course, she referenced feeling controlled by Diana, but the fact that she argued raised doubts about total control. It appeared to be equal participation by mother and daughter in planning the poisoning of their loved ones. Rachel revealed that poisoning Sarah came as a surprise to her. She believed the primary reason wasn't the girl's debts, but a simple argument. Sarah and her mother constantly clashed. Diana considered her extremely irritating. As for 12-year-old Brianna, Rachel gave vague comments. According to her, the teenager was also seen as a burden, so the youngest family member was also intended to be eliminated. Finally, Diana was informed of her daughter's confession and asked to tell the truth for accuracy, as lying further was pointless. She complied. According to the widow, her hatred for her husband began because he didn't attract her. Additionally, his extravagance and complete inability to support the family irritated her. She accused him of verbal and physical abuse and domestic violence. Nevertheless, none of the people familiar with the deceased confirmed these claims. Even Rachel's diary noted that the father was a model family man who would harm himself before harming anyone else. Despite Rachel and Diana continuing to cite feelings of resentment, detectives believed the motive for the murders was more mundane. Specifically, life insurance policies were taken out on each family member. The widow used the payout after her husband's death to buy a newer, larger home. This was just the beginning of their sinister plan. Life insurance was also taken out on Sean and Sarah, which she planned to collect. Rachel's diary detailed her reflections on the events. thoroughly studied for use in court. Finally, Diana admitted why Sarah was taken to the hospital, unlike the other two victims. Apparently, Rachel simply didn't want another death in the new house. It wasn't that they cared about Sarah's survival. They simply viewed a dying relative as a burden, just like everyone else. Rachel sincerely excused this behavior. She recounted numerous regrets related to her deceased brother. The image of him lying on the floor with blood pooling from his mouth, cold, pale hands, and glassy eyes was etched in her memory. After moving into his room, she repeatedly wrote in her diary about her anxious state during this period. She had recurring nightmares where Sean appeared. Rachel and Diana were arrested and charged with first-degree murders. No bail was granted. The Lutheran Church, which the Stout family attended, wrote a letter of support during this difficult time on behalf of all parishioners. Despite the pastor himself reporting his suspicions to the police, he initiated this letter and prayed for their souls. Rachel pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against her mother. She took responsibility for 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted second-degree murder. In total, she received 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 42 years. This means she will be eligible for release in 2055 at the age of 64. At sentencing, she apologized to her sister Sarah, who survived the poisoning, relearned to walk and speak, and underwent prolonged rehabilitation. Later, Rachel petitioned for a reduced sentence, demanding a retrial, citing fear of her male attorney. She claimed she was intimidated by him and forced to give these confessions. Additionally, she argued that no psychiatric evaluation was conducted. Rachel began insisting she had mental health issues. Ultimately, this appeal was rejected in 2018, and she made no further attempts to lighten her punishment. Diana Stout was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Until the end, she used vague language, refusing to fully admit guilt. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In one of her last interviews, Diana insisted she wasn't involved in her husband's death and blamed it on his addiction to alcohol and illegal substances. Allegedly, he associated with dangerous people and suffered as a result. At that moment, the woman was so tired of her husband and hated him so much that she didn't intend to help him. When Mark died, it was a relief for her. No evidence of Mark's addiction was found. This new version contradicted the diary entries and Rachel's testimony, so no one believed her. Sarah's life would never be the same. She never fully recovered from the severe poisoning and lives in a special center with a guardian. The girl dreams of her deceased father and brother and believes they, as guardian angels, watch over her. Sarah forgave her mother and sister and doesn't hold a grudge against them due to her faith. She is a devout Christian and spends a lot of time in church. The girl hopes to fulfill her dream of becoming a French translator and visiting Paris.
Even among notorious criminals, there are those who stand out for their particular cruelty and sadism. True monsters. Today's story is about such monsters in human form. Deborah Evans, or Debbie as her close ones called her, was born on May 6, 1967, in a deeply religious family in Chicago, Illinois, USA, where she was the eldest of 4 children. She was always a loud and cheerful girl, very mischievous. Despite her active and positive attitude towards life, she struggled with low self-esteem, which began to develop after her parents' divorce. Probably because of this, Debbie sought understanding but chose the wrong direction. She frequently interacted with and got involved with men much older than her, who likely reminded her of her father. Eventually, this led to an unintended pregnancy at the age of 18. On September 29, 1985, a girl was born, whom Debbie named Samantha. The young mother was happy and dedicated all her time and attention to her child. Meanwhile, the relationship between Debbie and the biological father of the child began to crack. She tried to keep the relationship intact, but it was all in vain. Soon, their relationship completely fell apart and the couple broke up. During this period, family members noticed a sharp decline in Debbie's self-esteem. This was linked to postpartum depression and the extra weight she had gained during pregnancy, from which she could not get rid of. Debbie was deeply insecure, but tried to find a new partner through various dating clubs. It only took a small sign of interest for Debbie to reciprocate. For many, her behavior might have seemed frivolous, but her friends and family believed she was on a quest to find happiness. She began relationships with several men at once. 3 years later, her second child, a boy named Joshua, was born. The boy had spinal issues which affected the development of his legs. He required frequent medical care, and from the first months of his life, he became a regular patient at the local medical center. Her relationship with the father of the boy did not work out, so Debbie could not rely on his help. The single mother lived on benefits and with the support of relatives, especially the father of her first child. In 1989, a 22-year-old woman started dating a 24-year-old man named James Edwards. The following 6 years of their relationship saw frequent breakups and reunions. The young man became an integral part of the little family's life, despite the occasional difficulties in understanding each other. Later, Debbie met a dark-skinned guy named Laverne Ward. She found herself torn between the new boyfriend, who was 4 years younger, and her longtime boyfriend, James. In 1994, Debbie gave birth to a son named Jordan. She believed that Laverne was the biological father of the child. The boy was dark-skinned, like Laverne. Despite this, Debbie couldn't fully commit to either of her boyfriends, continuing to bounce between them. During this time, she lived on benefits, but actively tried to find a job. James was much more stable and serious than Laverne. He had a decent job and was actually able to support a family, so he was her priority. By the end of 1994, Debbie decided to move to a safer area of Illinois and chose an apartment on the western outskirts of the small town of Edison. She finally made up her mind and wanted to stay with James. During this period, their relationship became respectful and warm. Even Josh, who had congenital spinal problems, had recovered and become a healthy, quite athletic boy for his age. It seemed like life was getting back on track. By March 1995, James had moved in with his girlfriend. Unexpectedly, Debbie told her boyfriend that she was pregnant again. She wanted to name the future son Elijah. In November 1995, it was expected that within a few weeks, 28-year-old Debbie would be admitted to the hospital. She was in her 9th month of pregnancy and could give birth at any moment. It was expected that she would be admitted to the maternity ward on November 19th, and her labor would be induced on November 20th. No one suspected that Debbie wouldn't make it to the medical center, but the reason for her absence turned out to be even more terrifying. Around 5:30 p.m. on November 16, 1995, James left for work. It was nearby, so he didn't take the car. His shift ended at 2:30 a.m. When he returned home, he noticed a suspicious light in the room, although Debbie and the children were supposed to be asleep. This seemed strange to him, and he became cautious, thinking perhaps Debbie had gone into labor. As he got closer to the house, James became even more worried when he noticed that the front door was unlocked. He entered the house and immediately saw suspicious bloodstains in the kitchen. Little Jordan, covered in blood, came toward him. James quickly checked the child, and it seemed like he was fine. He called out to his girlfriend, but there was no answer. When James entered the bedroom, he saw her lying on the bed. Debbie was covered with a blanket and seemed unusual. She was clearly not asleep. James thought his girlfriend was playing a prank, pretending to be asleep as she had done before. However, when he gently pulled the blanket aside, he realized that things weren't as he had thought. 28-year-old Deborah was no longer showing any signs of life, and her abdomen was empty. In panic, James began calling the children's names, but no one answered except for Jordan. He ran to the room of 10-year-old Samantha and found her lying on the floor. The girl also showed no signs of life. There was a noticeable wound on her neck. He couldn't find 8-year-old Josh. James immediately called emergency services. When the police arrived at the scene, they found the young man next to Debbie. He looked confused and clearly didn't understand what was happening. He repeatedly asked the police and medical staff his loved ones were alive. He began to cry after receiving a negative answer. Forensics examined Debbie's body and found that her abdomen had been damaged, likely due to an unskilled procedure. The infant could not be found in the apartment. 1.5-year-old Jordan was covered in blood, but not because something had happened to him. He was likely stained after witnessing the tragic incident, possibly trying to help his mother and sister. It was unclear where 8-year-old Josh was. The police immediately began searching for the boy, first turning to the neighbors. While they were interviewing locals, forensics continued to examine the crime scene and the surrounding area. Large kitchen scissors, often used for cutting food, were found outside. They were covered in blood, which might indicate that they were used to cause the damage. During the search, several fingerprints were collected, which likely belonged to the perpetrators. It also became clear that the intruders had entered the house without breaking in, suggesting that Deborah knew the attackers and may have voluntarily let them inside. Detectives were dealing with a rare type of crime, as the criminal must have been closely monitoring the victim to know when it was the right moment to steal the infant. The first person brought in for questioning was the deceased's cohabitant, as well as the surviving child, whose blood was sampled for analysis. In such cases, it's usually the closest people involved. Therefore, it was necessary to verify James's involvement in the crime. When the victim's relatives were notified and arrived at the station to speak with the detectives, they all insisted that James was a great guy. They claimed that the couple had a loving relationship and were eagerly awaiting the expansion of their family. Therefore, he could not possibly be guilty of what had happened. From the start, James was very cooperative with the police. He provided all the necessary information and even volunteered to take a polygraph test. James wanted to be removed from the list of suspects as soon as possible so that the focus could shift to finding the real criminal. The family provided valuable information about Deborah's former boyfriend, Laverne Ward, who was the biological father of the surviving 1.5-year-old Jordan and also a member of a local gang. It became known that throughout their relationship, Laverne had repeatedly abused Deborah, locking her up and keeping her at home. She had tried several times to get a restraining order against him, but each time the manipulator managed to talk her out of it. However, shortly before the crime, she had finally succeeded in obtaining a restraining order. Deborah's sisters knew that the couple had broken up 7 to 8 months ago, which was the last time Laverne had been seen. Despite this, Laverne continued to appear in Deborah's life. The family didn't know all the details of their relationship, but Deborah's sisters mentioned that she continued to maintain a connection with Laverne's family, bringing 1.5-year-old Jordan to see them. Unfortunately, no one knew the Ward family well, except for one of Laverne's cousins, who was also pregnant at the time. Unfortunately, no one could remember the name of this girl. Deborah's current boyfriend, James, confirmed that his relationship with Laverne had been very aggressive and frightening. This was one of the reasons why Deborah was relieved to end it. However, due to their shared child, they still had to cross paths. During the search of the crime scene, several items were found that didn't belong to either James or Deborah. At the same time, several of James' personal belongings were missing. Some of the items were taken for examination. Neighbors helped confirm James's statements and provided valuable information about Laverne. James' alibi was confirmed by his employers and colleagues. James had indeed been at the sorting center the entire evening. However, the neighbors could not identify the attacker. They had not seen who had committed the crime. But one woman noticed a group of suspicious young people near the house in the evening hours, consisting of 2 black men and 1 Latino. After one of the locals asked them what they were doing, the group simply scattered. The investigation then involved specially trained dogs to trace the whereabouts of 8-year-old Joshua and the infant. Based on the behavior of the animals, which stopped at roughly the same spot, it was concluded that the children were taken by car to the north of the apartment complex where Deborah lived. According to one of the deceased's sisters, in August of that same year, Laverne told Debbie that he considered himself the father of the unborn child and demanded that she give him the new boy. However, she refused, insisting that the child was James's. The sister also mentioned that just 2 days before the murder, Debbie complained about being stalked by Laverne. He repeatedly ambushed her on the street, insulted her, and tried to provoke a conflict. During this time, Deborah began to worry about her safety and seriously considered obtaining a restraining order, which she later received. Given that they had already had conflicts involving physical violence, Laverne had multiple criminal convictions and was a gang member, he seemed like a likely suspect, especially considering that his son Jordan was the only one who wasn't harmed. Unfortunately, at that time, Laverne couldn't be tracked, so the police attempted to contact his last girlfriend, Cynthia Sawyer. When they arrived at her home, neither the young woman nor the suspect was present. The landlord said he hadn't seen Laverne in a while, but pointed them toward Cynthia, suggesting they could speak with her. He also gave the police access to search the apartment, but it yielded no results. Therefore, the officers immediately set off to find Cynthia. They eventually located her, and she claimed she wasn't involved with the criminal, but kept in touch because they had a child together. She also knew that shortly before these events, Laverne had been imprisoned for drug trafficking. Cynthia shared that, according to Debbie, Laverne wasn't the father of the missing infant, something the deceased had insisted upon. Nevertheless, Laverne was convinced otherwise and was practically obsessed with the child in Debbie's womb. After Deborah's death, Laverne called Cynthia and threatened her, saying she would suffer the same fate as Deborah unless she obeyed him. Cynthia was certain that he was behind the crime. Cynthia mentioned that Laverne might have stayed with a 30-year-old close acquaintance named Laura. She provided a lead on how to find her and also shared information with the police about the family members of the main suspect. This allowed investigators to find a reliable source of information and uncover the true identity of the young man. However, the suspected murderer wasn't there either, but Cynthia provided another address where Laverne might be hiding from the detectives. The next landlord was named Martha Martin. Laverne was her nephew, as she had recently married his uncle. The suspect was not there. Martha allowed the police to search the suspect's room, but once again, nothing significant was found. The people living there couldn't provide any compromising information. Meanwhile, the autopsy of the deceased was carried out. The forensic expert found 6 wounds on Samantha's neck. 5 of them were non-fatal, but the 6th one severed the jugular vein and broke one of the cervical vertebrae. There were numerous defensive wounds on the girl's body. It was believed that she had been killed as a witness. No sexual trauma was found on Samantha's body. And foreign object of small size was discovered. It appeared to have been inserted from behind. Following this, there were signs of damage to the neck area. A cut in the lower abdomen was also noted. Through this hole, the child was removed and the umbilical cord was likely cut with a tool found on the street. This raised the question of whether the child survived after this makeshift barbaric procedure. As forensic experts knew, a fetus can survive no more than 5 minutes after the mother's heart stops. This meant that the killer had to act very clearly, confidently, and quickly. Ideally, this would be done by someone with medical training, but even they would need help. It led to the assumption that the attacker was not working alone. According to criminologists who examined the crime scene, the heroine's heart was still beating when she was cut open and the child was taken. This strengthened the suspicion that there were multiple perpetrators. It would have been impossible to immobilize an adult woman and hold her down to perform such a procedure alone. Ultimately, consulting with experienced experts confirmed these concerns. The murderer wasn't alone. Laverne definitely had help. This brought attention to a group of 2 black men and 1 Latino who had been loitering near the victim's house around the time of the crime. Their description matched Laverne's group. In practice, such crimes are very rare. Usually, a woman is involved in cases where a child is targeted. This is a kind of kidnapping, often when a woman is unable to have children and decides to take someone else's baby. Many questions remained, but it was clear that the criminal intended to preserve the child's life. The fate of 8-year-old Josh was still unknown. Who and why took him and baby Elijah remained a mystery. When the police visited the school where the boy attended and spoke with a social worker, new unpleasant details about Deborah's life emerged. It was suggested that there might have been physical abuse by her new boyfriend, James. There were grounds to believe that James had been abusive toward the woman and the missing schoolboy. After visiting the school, the police were unable to determine where Josh might be, but suspicions again arose that the victim's boyfriend could have been involved in some way. Then, unexpectedly, around noon on November 18th, 1995, a man from a neighboring town, located just 10 minutes away, called the police station. He said that as soon as he saw the missing Josh on the news, he immediately recognized the boy. His girlfriend, Patrice Scott, had been babysitting a child exactly like the boy in the police photo, but by that time, his girlfriend had already taken the child and left. The man explained that on the night of Deborah's murder, a black man and a woman they didn't know knocked on their window. They handed over 8-year-old Josh, saying that someone needed to look after him because his mother had been killed in a shooting related to a bad drug deal. After that, they just ran away, and the next day they came to pick up the boy. This information seemed very interesting, so the detectives hurried to verify it. When they finally managed to meet with Patrice, she confirmed the story. She also described the black man who turned out to be Laverne and his companion, a woman named Jacqueline. From the very beginning, the young woman appeared nervous and said that she had just given birth and couldn't care for the schoolboy. That night, Josh stayed with her. Patrice heard a heartbreaking story from the boy when he woke up screaming. According to him, 4 strangers came to his mother, climbed through the bedroom window, cut open her stomach, killed his sister, and took his unborn brother. Patrice thought it was just a bad dream, but now she understood that it was the terrifying reality the boy had experienced. She said that the next day, Jacqueline and her boyfriend Fidel came and took the boy. Patrice also noticed suspicious stains on Jacqueline's dress that looked like blood. Patrice led the police in the direction the group had gone, using the landscape to guide them as she didn't know the exact address. About 20 minutes later, the police arrived in the town of Maywood nearby. Here, in an alley, they found the lifeless body of the boy, Josh, without reaching Jacqueline's house. When the coroner performed the autopsy, they found identical injuries to those that killed Kirena and her daughter. Naturally, Jacqueline, Laverne, and Fidel could not be found at the address provided by Patrice. They had fled again. The officers then returned to the address where they had last seen the criminal. It was the home of his acquaintance, Laura. Authorities were allowed to search the room of the killer once more, but unfortunately, nothing was found there. Laura told the police about the complicated relationship between the victim and the likely killer. It turned out that when Deborah got along well with Laverne, she admitted that she was pregnant with his child. But when they broke up and she got back together with James, she told a different story. This happened repeatedly, and in the end, Laverne became frustrated with the lies. He harbored a grudge against his ex. Apparently, Deborah did this to keep her latest boyfriend around. Thanks to Laura, the main suspect was tracked down and arrested. During the interrogation, Laverne behaved arrogantly and insisted that he would never harm a child. He also did not confirm the police's suspicions that Jacqueline or her boyfriend Fidel could have been involved in the incident. Reluctantly, the criminal agreed to cooperate with the investigation. He mentioned seeing Jacqueline and Fidel on the day of the murder, but could not say where they were now. While gathering information about other witnesses, Jacqueline's identity was revealed. She was an ordinary girl, and her mother, Martha Martin, had married Laverne's uncle. That's how they became related. However, Jacqueline's life didn't go as planned. She became pregnant at a young age, dropped out of school, had no education, and struggled to find decent work. By the age of 20, she had 3 children, which led her to decide to undergo a procedure to prevent future pregnancies. Jacqueline had a low IQ, which made it difficult for her to find stable employment. Eventually, she turned to petty crime to make ends meet, as welfare benefits weren't enough for her and her children. She was often abused by various boyfriends, which made violence feel normal to her. Her history included multiple arrests and imprisonments. By the time of the events being considered, she was 27 years old. Martha still couldn't understand how her daughter had ended up living such a life. Jacqueline's boyfriend, Fidel, grew up in an even more unstable environment with a mother and grandmother who suffered from paranoia, schizophrenia, and delusional behavior. He was raised in an atmosphere that was genuinely terrifying and incomprehensible to any reasonable person. As a result, Fidel became a typical product of marginalized communities. When his relationship with Jacqueline began, she was manipulative from the start. Additionally, she practiced voodoo to make Fidel completely submit to her. After a couple of rituals, their relationship became even more bizarre. For example, she made him drink her menstrual blood, believing it would give her total control over him. In case of a breakup, she threatened to kill herself. During conflicts, she would behave irrationally. On one occasion, she even ran over one of Fidel's acquaintances with a car, suspecting infidelity. She constantly inflicted harm on herself, such as scratching her face during these episodes. She even stabbed her boyfriend with a knife, but had not killed anyone until then. Despite all of this, she obtained medical training and was allowed to work as a certified nursing assistant. The puzzle started to come together. It became clear how the criminals were able to perform a cesarean section with scissors. One of the perpetrators knew how to do it. Jacqueline no longer wanted to have children, but her new boyfriend, Fidel, was 6 years younger and desperately wanted to become a father. He also wanted to have a lighter-skinned child and asked Jacqueline to fulfill his dream. About a year before the attack, she began claiming that she was pregnant. This seemed strange, given her infertility after the procedure, but she really appeared to be pregnant. Her belly even began to protrude. Jacqueline became close to pregnant women, behaving oddly during this time, shifting her due date, and telling others that doctors had made a mistake, but she still remained close with pregnant friends. Whenever it turned out that one of them was having a girl, Jacqueline immediately lost interest. Everything started to make sense. It seemed that she had long been planning to steal someone else's baby, and she specifically wanted a boy, and one that was light-skinned. The baby, Elijah, who was supposed to be born to Deborah in just a few days, seemed to be the perfect candidate that Laverne had offered Jacqueline. This was likely the motive behind the gruesome act of removing the baby from its mother's womb. When Jacqueline's sister Tina was contacted, she revealed that Jacqueline had recently given birth. She had shared this with the entire family, but by that time, everyone already doubted the truth of her pregnancy and childbirth. It became clear that Jacqueline had been passing off the abducted Elijah as her own child. The baby might still be alive. A warrant for the arrest of the criminals was immediately issued. Officers arrived at the address provided by Jacqueline's sister, but Jacqueline was not at home. A neighbor agreed to let the officers wait for the return of the criminals. Soon after, Jacqueline arrived holding a small child. Fidel was driving, wearing a hoodie that matched the description of the clothing missing from Deborah's home. Jacqueline, now pretending to be the mother, presented a forged birth certificate for the baby and named him Fidel Jr. The child was taken to the hospital for an examination and DNA testing, while Fidel and Jacqueline were arrested. As soon as the news of the arrest spread, Patrice came forward again. She claimed to know more about the events and revealed that the three criminals had disposed of the child as an unwanted witness. She felt she could now tell the truth, as the entire gang had been apprehended. Patrice explained that she had immediately noticed something was off when Joshua was handed over to her. He was wearing a bloody jacket, but he had no shoes or pants. The next day, when Jacqueline returned to pick up Joshua, Patrice questioned her about the suspicious details. Jacqueline reluctantly told Joshua it was time to take his medicine, but the boy insisted that he wasn't taking any medicine. Jacqueline forced him to swallow something, causing him to vomit. Realizing that Joshua could expose them, the gang took him to Jacqueline's house, where they strangled him with an electrical cord in the laundry room. After the boy stopped showing signs of life, Jacqueline inflicted further injuries to his neck and chest before they disposed of him. Amidst the tragic events that had affected the entire family, the news that Elijah was alive became a beacon of hope. Patrice admitted that she had lied to the police during their initial conversation out of fear for her life, as she had been threatened if she told the truth. During the interrogations, Fidel denied everything. Jacqueline tried to justify the appearance of the end by claiming that she had checked into the hospital under a fictitious name because she didn't have insurance, and there, one of the women handed her her son, whom she had abandoned. However, a DNA test revealed that the baby was indeed Deborah's child. All three were charged with first-degree murder of Deborah, Samantha, and Joshua, as well as the kidnapping of Joshua and Elijah under aggravating circumstances. The criminals faced the death penalty. During the investigation, it was discovered how the criminals obtained the weapon. They received the gun through an acquaintance. It was a weapon they intended to use, allegedly for self-defense, to go to a deal involving illegal substances. The number of people involved in the crime was unprecedented. After Elijah was discharged from the hospital, Deborah's father assumed custody of the baby, and also Jordan. The man raised the children on his own. Later, it was proven that Jacqueline had been faking her pregnancy all along and was selecting a victim to kidnap a child. Laverne, who hated his ex, suggested how to carry out the plan. The thug wanted to take revenge on Deborah. Jacqueline needed a child, and Fidel became just a pawn in their hands. On that fateful night, 24-year-old Laverne, along with 28-year-old Jacqueline and 22-year-old Fidel, came to Deborah's apartment. The woman was not afraid and let the group into her apartment. Laverne tried to convince Deborah to give her child to Jacqueline voluntarily in exchange for $2,000, but she refused the offer. This part of the plan seemed implausible because the criminals had no such money. Following the reconstruction of events, Fidel Kefi and his accomplices went to Deborah's apartment with the intention of kidnapping her child. During the incident, they harmed Deborah and then proceeded to the bedroom of her 10-year-old daughter, Samantha. Meanwhile, Jacqueline took the infant, trying to create the illusion that the baby was hers. She did everything possible to calm the baby and bring it to a safe condition. After the baby was ready, the group left the house, taking the baby and Joshua, leaving Jordan alone with the tragic consequences of the incident. The knife used to kill Joshua was later found in Jacqueline's dishwasher. A blood-stained sheet was discovered several blocks from Joshua's body and matched the bedding found in Jacqueline's house. Blood from the victims was found on many items, including meat scissors, a cord, an elastic band, and jackets. DNA testing confirmed that Laverne Ward was the father of both living boys. Jacqueline and Fidel were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. Laverne was also found guilty, but the jury deemed that there was not enough evidence for the death penalty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 60 years. However, in 2003, the governor of Illinois commuted the death sentences to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Jacqueline attempted to have her sentence reduced. In a petition from 2012, she wrote that she had reformed and felt she deserved to return to society and reunite with her family, including her 3 children and 6 grandchildren. Jacqueline wrote that she missed the smell of flowers and the embraces of her family. She long maintained that her confession to the murder had been coerced, claiming she was starved and forced to sign a document under duress. Her petition was rejected. All 3 criminals remain in state prisons to this day and will never be released. Sometimes, the difference between a criminal and their victim is so vast that it seems impossible to oppose the aggressor. But some people are given such a strong will to live that even a child can find the strength to stop a ruthless thug. Sari Vosfar was certain that her vitality and ability to resist any circumstances were inherited from her courageous and strong father. The girl was born in the U.S. in 1980. She was the firstborn of Patricia, an American woman, and Amadari Vosfar, a Middle Eastern immigrant. Amadari had moved from Iran to Pensacola, Florida in search of the American dream. He was happy to have established himself in a new place and to have found a woman he truly loved. They got married. But from the very beginning, there were challenges. Patricia turned out to be headstrong and at times completely uncontrollable. At first, Ahmad believed this was just part of the American mentality and tried to be patient. He was committed to building a family and thought everything would change once they had a child. So, the birth of their first daughter, whom they named Saya, was a joyful event. 2 years later, they had another daughter named Sarah, and then a third child, a boy named Arash. By this time, noticeable tension had already developed in their relationship. Patricia had an unpredictable and quarrelsome nature. She was neither disciplined nor obedient, as Ahmad had expected based on his cultural background. In his view, she behaved inappropriately. What irritated him the most was his wife's love for partying, drinking, and smoking weed. Despite the fact that Ahmad worked tirelessly to provide for the family, Patricia showed little concern for their children or her husband's struggles. The longer Ahmad stayed in the relationship, the more he realized that Patricia simply wasn't meant for family life. The mother and father had completely different views on raising their children. Ahmad demanded discipline and proper care, while Patricia was uninterested. She just wanted to have fun. After yet another party and conflict, the man decided he had had enough. Their disagreements led to a contentious divorce. The biggest issue arose from Patricia's desire to gain full custody of the children and completely cut off their father from their lives. At that time, Saya was 5 years old, her sister was only 3, and their brother, Arash, was still an infant. Despite the fact that Patricia hardly fit the image of a responsible mother, as a U.S. citizen, she had more legal rights and managed to secure primary custody of the children. The court ordered Ahmad to pay child support, allowing him only occasional visits with his children. The man was unhappy with this outcome. He had wanted full custody himself, convinced that his reckless ex-wife was incapable of properly raising 3 children. In his view, Patricia was dangerous, but the court was deaf and blind to his concerns. Struggling with this loss, he ultimately decided to leave Florida. He settled in Rochester, New York, where he aimed to start his life anew. Driven and determined, the immigrant quickly remarried, built a career, and found success. His second wife was much better suited for family life. She was raising children from a previous marriage and doing an excellent job. Yet, even years later, Ahmad remained deeply concerned about his children from his first marriage. He was frustrated that he couldn't spend as much time with them as he wanted. Moreover, with each visit, he noticed more and more troubling signs in their home environment and behavior. Despite fulfilling all court-ordered obligations, paying child support and visiting his daughters and son, he saw that the children were not well nourished. He also knew that Patricia was struggling with substance abuse during that period, though, in truth, the word struggling was probably an overstatement. During this period, her home began to resemble a drug den, with suspicious young men frequently coming and going. The girls described disturbing scenes that could only lead to trouble. Ahmad feared that strangers were using substances alongside his ex-wife right in front of the children. He was convinced that his daughters and son were in danger. Time and again, he went to court, petitioning for full custody, desperately trying to take his children away from that environment. But each time, his requests were denied. Ahmad was certain that his background played a role in these rulings. Many shared this belief. If he had been born in America, he likely wouldn't have faced such obstacles in his fight for custody. Meanwhile, his ex-wife seemed to take pleasure in making life miserable for both him and their children. Life with Patricia had never been easy. Ahmad's fears for his daughters and son turned out to be justified. Her substance abuse issues frequently led to legal trouble. The children were essentially left without parental supervision. Her version of parenting was marked by complete disregard for their safety. She would leave them alone for hours while she spent time in bars. She usually returned in a foul mood, intoxicated, and sometimes resorted to physical violence. Verbal abuse became so common that the children barely reacted to it. On some mornings, while nursing a hangover, she would take things even further. There were instances where she burned her children with cigarettes. Whenever Ahmad confronted her about this, she dismissed it as discipline and punishment, even threatening to send the kids to foster care. Ahmad was powerless. He feared that the children could actually be placed in a foster home, cutting him off from them entirely. He was horrified by the court's indifference and Patricia's abusive methods. From a young age, Saya took on the role of a mother to her younger brother and sister. She cooked for them, got them ready, and took care of them. Every morning, she made sure they didn't miss the school bus. She also learned to avoid her mother whenever possible. Every interaction with Patricia ended in insults and pain. While their mother partied in random bars and apartments across the city, the children could go days without seeing her. The girls became especially close, as 6-year-old Sarah was already able to help 8-year-old Saya take care of their brother and manage household chores. They bonded so much that they even dressed alike and looked similar, often being mistaken for twins. Unfortunately, Patricia's reckless relationships and unstable behavior had not yet reached their peak at this point. The negligent mother met a boyfriend named Raymond Wake. At first, he seemed like a pleasant man. He treated the children warmly, even bringing them treats and gifts they rarely saw, quickly winning their affection. However, behind this facade of friendliness lurked a criminal involved in burglary, possession of illegal substances, and many other horrific acts. Patricia was unaware of the dark side, yet Ahmad was certain that this wouldn't have stopped his ex-wife, who had hit rock bottom, from getting to know and forming a relationship with a potential criminal. On the contrary, she was happy that Ray helped with the children and that she had no more worries. Her indifference as a mother and her struggles with alcohol created the perfect opportunity for Raymond to indulge his twisted fantasies. The charm of friendly Ray quickly turned into unease. Despite his age, Saya immediately noticed unusual traits in his behavior. Even when surrounded by several adults, her mother's boyfriend showed no interest in interacting with people his own age. Raymond often looked for moments to be around the girls, sometimes entering their space when they were engaged in their own activities. When he stayed over, he would occasionally enter the bedroom while Saya and Sarah were preparing for bed. He would remain in the corner for a while, but wouldn't interfere with their personal space. The older sister noticed his gaze, which struck her as odd. She discussed it with her sister, and she too understood what was going on. She also felt uncomfortable when he stared at them, and both girls felt uneasy in his presence. Ray's insistence on spending time with the children caused them to feel disturbed. Realizing what was happening, Ray began to behave aggressively toward the older girl, threatening to harm her brother and sister if she decided to tell anyone about what had occurred. Ray continued to use his power, trying to cover up his actions. However, Saya was determined not to share this with anyone, as she genuinely feared for the safety of her loved ones. The man was not concerned that Patricia might catch him, as she was either not home or was drunk and incapable of protecting the children. This situation continued for several months until Patricia decided to end her relationship with Ray. She found herself in a difficult position, realizing she had become involved with a dangerous man and made the decision to end the relationship. Ahmad never learned about the horrors that Saya endured during that time. Saya herself breathed a sigh of relief when Ray disappeared from their lives, but she was hasty in her relief. During this period, the woman began spending even more time at bars, leaving the children to fend for themselves for entire days. She chose illicit substances, alcohol, and chaotic relationships over being a responsible mother. On September 21st, 1988, Patricia left for another party, leaving her new boyfriend in the apartment. A couple of hours later, he left and joined her at the bar. For 8-year-old Saya, this wasn't unusual. She had already become accustomed to taking on the motherly role for her family. The girl had prepared breakfast, laid out clothes, and got everyone into bed the night before, leaving some tasks for the morning. She usually got up early to prepare her brother and sister for school so she could get everything done quickly and escape before her mother returned home. Typically, Patricia wasn't home at that time. The children managed to avoid crossing paths with their mother, preventing another conflict or possible humiliation. Unfortunately, that night, she was in for an even more unpleasant encounter. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, the girl opened her eyes, realizing something was wrong in the room. Waking up in her bed, Saya saw the dark figure of an adult person in the room. Upon closer inspection, she realized it was Ray. The family lived on the first floor of an apartment complex, and it wasn't hard to get in through the back door. The ex-mother immediately woke up the girls, dressed them, and forced them to follow her to her mother's green pickup truck, a Dodge Monaco, which was parked under the windows. Then he drove them into the forest. Ray said he was going to take them to their mother, who was at his house. The older girl was sure he was lying, but she couldn't do anything and just hoped for the best. They arrived at the place. Worried, Saya looked into the darkness, trying to understand where they were and what was happening. The girl tried to hide her growing panic and wiped away her tears when Ray opened the door. The man asked her if she had told anyone about their secret. The girl shook her head, which made Ray happy. The man promised again that the sisters would soon see their mother, as long as they behaved well. Ray took something from the trunk and locked Sarah in the back seat. He took Saya out and led her to the trunk. What he was doing there, I can't tell you on YouTube, but I think you can understand what was happening. It's horrible. The sister heard screams and asked her what was happening, but the older girl didn't tell her anything. She just reassured her sister that everything would be fine and they would return home soon. Suddenly, the lights of an approaching car appeared. Ray quickly climbed out of the trunk and ordered Saya to return to the front seats of the car. He made the girls lower their heads and stay silent. The car stopped nearby. Ray walked up to the driver, and they talked about something. Soon, the car left, taking the last hope of rescue with it. Ray got behind the wheel and drove the car deeper into the forest, where no one would find them. Then the man opened the front passenger door and began doing it right in the front seat, now right in front of his sister's eyes. Terrified, Sarah cried, but couldn't do anything. By morning, Ray finally calmed down. He untied Sarah and ordered the girls to get out of the car. The sisters' torment had already been going on for several hours. Ray led them into the forest. Throughout this, he remained silent, simply ignoring any questions. Saya told her sister that she didn't believe he was leading them to their mother. Patricia truly had no idea what was happening. She was too busy at yet another bar to worry about her daughters. Everything seemed even more alarming when the man began tying Sarah's hands and feet. Ray made both girls kneel and ordered them to pray. Standing behind them, the criminal pulled out a sharp object. Startled, she fell but remained conscious. She felt her clothes instantly soak with blood, but decided to pretend to be unconscious. Her sister saw him approaching Sarah and tried to resist the criminal. Of course, the odds were uneven. They couldn't even escape. She suffered several injuries and also fell to the ground. Saya saw all of this and continued pretending, praying that he would just leave. Ray stepped over her. The older girl listened to his footsteps fade away. As soon as the car engine started and he drove off from the forest, Saya got up and immediately ran to her sister. At first, she tried to wake Sarah, begging her to come too so they could go for help together. Realizing that Sarah wasn't responding, Saya decided to call for help. The older sister made her way to the road that passed by the forest. The child knew they urgently needed medical help. The first car that passed by stopped. Inside was an elderly couple. They were shocked by the sight of the girl covered in blood. Saya told them that her sister needed help and pointed in the general direction of the forest before collapsing unconscious. At 6:30 a.m., the couple called 911. The girl, who had miraculously survived, was taken to a medical center for treatment. The doctors couldn't understand how she was still alive, considering the blood loss and the wound she had sustained. After surviving the attack, Saya was just beginning to face the hardships ahead. She was sent to the hospital in critical condition. According to reports, the child was resuscitated 3 times during the battle for her life. She had lost a lot of blood and a transfusion was required. The doctors believed the child's survival was a true miracle. Somehow, the knife's blade had passed just millimeters away from her jugular vein. If it had cut the vein, the scenario could have been completely different. She likely wouldn't have made it to the road. She would have passed out before reaching the cars and likely would have died from blood loss. According to medical experts, she faced a long recovery ahead, filled with physical strain and pain. Obviously, all of this was compounded by emotional trauma. When the police contacted the girl's mother, Patricia was still recovering a night of drinking. She hadn't even noticed that her daughters were missing from the apartment. Once Saya regained consciousness and was able to speak, the survivor asked about Sarah. By that time, the police had already discovered her sister's body. It was found in the forest, exactly where Saya had indicated. Her death had been instantaneous. The girl couldn't be saved. Brave Saya quickly became a crucial witness for the police. She was eager to speak with the detectives as soon as she could, providing them with a detailed description of Ray's green car, as well as the criminal himself. That very same day, they managed to locate him. The man was at his parents' house, and the car was there as well. The detectives only had to glance through the window to find blood-stained clothes inside. When they knocked on Ray's door, he ignored the noise as if there was no one there. But when the phone rang, he answered it. The dispatcher warned the criminal that the house was surrounded by police and that he should surrender. He understood it was over. The man didn't resist and simply stepped outside with his hands raised, surrendering to the authorities. Despite everything she had endured, Saya was determined to testify against the criminal in court to seek justice for her deceased sister. Finally, the court ruled that the children had been put in danger because of their irresponsible mother and sided with Ahmad. The father was granted custody of his son and daughter. When the girl began to recover and was discharged from the medical center, the man took both children to Rochester. He was already living there with his new wife, who embraced the children who had survived all that hell with their mother. They supported them and helped them adjust to the new environment. The family became large as the stepmother had children of her own. Finally, the brother and sister could feel stability and the protection of loved ones who truly cared about them. From the very beginning, Ray denied his involvement in the attack on the children. However, searches of his house and car uncovered many significant pieces of evidence. Most notably, traces of blood on his clothes and in the car, as well as on Saya's body, indicated violent actions. The key evidence against the defendant came from the testimony of the girl who had miraculously survived the incident. Nevertheless, the detectives needed a long time to gather all the evidence and prepare the charges that the prosecution could present in court. The hearings began in mid-1989. Until that point, Ray had not admitted to any of the crimes, including kidnapping and inflicting bodily harm. According to him, someone had stolen his car on the night of the incident with the children. He claimed he was at home, relaxing, and didn't notice what had happened. The investigators were convinced Ray was lying. According to the prosecution's version, he broke into his former partner's apartment with a crowbar around 1 a.m. Afterward, he took Saya and her sister Sarah and drove them to the forest, where the tragic incident occurred. By the time the hearings began, the surviving girl was already 9 years old. She remained determined to seek justice, so she eagerly traveled from her father's home in Rochester to Florida. During the hearings, Ray constantly tried to intimidate the child, staring at her with a threatening gaze, but this didn't stop Saya from recounting the details of that horrific night. Thanks to her, investigators were able to find her sister's body about 150 meters from the road running through the forest area. Tire tracks matching Ray's car were found nearby. Detectives also discovered fabric scraps with bloodstains, which later turned out to be parts of clothing found in the defendant's car. Ahmad was deeply affected by the loss of his younger daughter, Sarah. He was eagerly awaiting the court's decision, hoping that this time justice would be on their side. Patricia, on the other hand, showed much less involvement in the proceedings. It seemed like, for her, it was just another excuse to drink. The defendant was not about to give up, as the charges carried a death penalty, and he felt he had nothing to lose. Despite all the evidence, which the prosecution believed was irrefutable, Ray continued to insist on his story about the car theft, calling all other evidence planted. When this didn't work, he started claiming that the police had broken the law by arresting him without a warrant. The court rejected these claims. Even without the physical evidence found after the arrest, there was enough grounds to detain the suspect. From the start, the prosecution acted with confidence. The defense lawyer himself believed in his client's guilt, so he focused not on denying the charges, but on trying to avoid the death penalty. The jury predictably found Ray guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. It was decided that the appropriate punishment for him would be the death penalty. Disagreeing with the verdict, Ray and his lawyer began to take action. This led to a series of appeals and other legal maneuvers that continued to delay the execution of the death sentence, allowing him to keep living in prison despite the verdict. Likely, he harbored a deep hatred for his little victim, whom he could never defeat. Ray even continued trying to torment Saya, repeatedly sending threatening letters, calling her a liar, who unjustly took away the freedom of an innocent man. However, the brave girl no longer took his threats seriously. She lived with her stepmother and father and truly felt safe there. Ahmad had created a supportive and stable environment for her, something she had never known until that point. On the outside, everything seemed to be going well. Unexpectedly, Patricia again interfered with this idyll. Despite her previous offenses, she attempted to regain custody of the children. This led to a prolonged court battle, and their father desperately fought to prevent any meetings with their mother at all. The children themselves didn't want to see her after everything they had been through. They even blamed her for Sarah's death. However, the grieving mother succeeded in getting them to visit her occasionally and spend holidays with her. Everything they had endured should have brought Patricia to her senses. But no, she did not change her cruel habits. She continued to drink and use substances, losing control and taking it out on the children. During their first holiday with her, after several days of drinking, she lost control, attacked the children, and burned them with cigarettes. Unfortunately, Ahmad once again couldn't do anything about it. The law was blatantly obstructing him. Patricia herself didn't allow the children to receive help, and the police seemed to turn a blind eye to all the reports of domestic violence. Social workers who frequently visited their home also appeared to ignore the situation. When Saya and Arash grew older, they had the right to decide for themselves how they wanted to live. Naturally, the teenagers didn't want to visit their mother and begged their father not to send them to Florida. In the end, both completely severed ties with their mother. Patricia wasn't about to give up easily and kept looking for loopholes to take the children back. Ahmad had no choice but to turn to the New York judicial system to gain full custody rights. He couldn't completely exclude contact with their mother as the law made that impossible. In Florida, the court ruled that suspending full custody from Patricia was only a temporary measure. Despite her history of neglectful and outright dangerous behavior towards the children, the judge claimed that Patricia wasn't responsible for what had happened to Sarah and Saya. It was entirely Ray's fault. This led to the launch of a campaign aimed at forcing the court to reconsider its decision in Ahmad's favor. The children still refused to see Patricia, but progress was only made thanks to the support of the local community. Several public demonstrations were held, calling for Patricia and the courts to grant permanent custody rights to their father. This process went on for quite some time, but ultimately it worked. The woman withdrew her petition to the court because Saya was about to turn 18, and the girl could no longer be forced to return to Florida against her will. The mother seemed completely uninterested in pursuing custody of her son, or perhaps just tired of the legal battles, but in any case, she stopped approaching the courts. In Ahmad's opinion, the reason for the judicial system's behavior lay in his background, but he was happy that it all worked out after all those years of effort. After graduating from high school, Saya went on to university and earned a degree in criminal law. Since the attack in the forest, her passion for justice had been unwavering. Saya first joined the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and worked on projects related to the fight against child exploitation. She also served as a police officer for the New York State Police. In 2004, she was notified that Ray had died in prison from cancer. The criminal spent more than 15 years constantly filing appeals to avoid the death penalty. But even on his deathbed, he remained a cruel monster in the memory of all who knew him well. Instead of showing remorse for his heinous acts, or at least admitting them, he wrote a final mocking letter to Saya. In it, Ray went into detail mocking that fateful night in the woods. Instead of feeling pain or anger, Saya saw this as a chance to grow stronger. She had witnessed the tragic loss of her younger sister and had been injured in a way that could have been fatal, yet she survived that terrifying night. Fortunately, despite her mother Patricia's efforts, her childhood remained filled with moments of happiness. Ray's attempts to break her spirit through threats and abuse were in vain. Despite the cruelty and challenges, Saya became someone who fought for honor and justice. Reflecting on the final letter from the criminal, she felt a sense of defeat for him. He had failed to overpower a defenseless child. Saya Vosfar showed incredible strength and resilience. After these events, she married her partner Kelly, and in 2010 they welcomed a son, Noah. In 2016, Saya was promoted to investigator in New York. It wasn't until 2022 that she chose to openly share her story, receiving support and recognition on that significant day. By then, she had dedicated over a decade of her life to law enforcement. She explained that sharing her story was a way to honor her sister Sarah, who hadn't been given the same opportunities in life. Throughout her career, Saya focused on the importance of addressing and preventing crimes like rape. In those early years, Ray had already committed several violent attacks, and he could have been removed from society. But the authorities didn't have a system in place to track such offenders. Though Saya often wondered if it would have made a difference, given her mother's behavior, she still dedicated her life to helping others. She has spoken to various groups about her experience, showing how she not only survived, but also found a way to heal and continue believing in herself and humanity. If you enjoyed my work, please consider subscribing to the channel and supporting this video with a like. Let's discuss this story in the comments. Thank you, and take care.